Under the dazzling studio lights, the atmosphere felt compressed, with tension spreading into every corner. The camera slowly panned across the rows of audience seats, capturing faces filled with anticipation and curiosity. All eyes were fixed on the center, where two chairs faced each other. Matthew Carter, the veteran host of LTV Night Show, stepped out with a confident demeanor. His black suit was crisply pressed, his tie neatly adjusted, but his gaze was as sharp as a razor. This was one of the most important nights of his career, a highly anticipated interview the entire nation was waiting for. Opposite Matthew, Donald Trump appeared. No introduction was needed. Just the sight of his golden hair and tall stature was enough for the entire room to recognize him. He was dressed in an elegant black suit, accented by his signature red tie. His stride was steady, his presence unwavering. Some in the audience clapped, while others remained silent, waiting to see the storm that was about to unfold. Matthew leaned back in his chair, tapping his pen lightly on the table, producing short, deliberate sounds. He had no intention of beating around the bush. Tonight, he aimed to create a groundbreaking moment. "Welcome to the show, Mr. Trump." Trump crossed his arms over his chest and nodded slowly. "Glad to be here." Matthew offered a thin smile, glancing down at the notes on the table. This was the moment to drop the question that everyone had been waiting for. "I won't waste time," he said, his tone calm but edged with sharp intent. "There is one question that millions want an answer to. Have you ever taken a DNA test for Barron Trump?" The room fell into an eerie silence. Breaths slowed, eyes locked onto Trump's face. But he did not appear angry, he did not raise an eyebrow or lean forward. He simply sat there, composed, as if he had anticipated the question. "I don't think this is an appropriate topic for discussion," Trump said, his voice deep and firm. Matthew smirked slightly, trying not to reveal his surprise. "I'm merely asking a question the public is curious about. Mr. Trump, many have raised suspicions." Trump cut him off, his gaze piercing. "So, is the purpose of this show to spread baseless speculations about a teenager just because the media has run out of things to dig up?" The studio was stunned. Not a single breath was drawn too loudly. The cameras locked onto every expression of the two men. And in that moment, the one controlling the game was no longer Matthew. The air was thick, as if a single spark could ignite an explosion. Matthew took a deep breath, trying to regain his professional composure. He leaned forward, his voice firm. "Mr. Trump, I think there's been some misunderstanding here. I only wanted..." But before he could finish, a choked sob unexpectedly broke the silence from the back row. All eyes immediately turned in that direction. A middle-aged woman with disheveled hair framing her weary face was trembling. She clutched a stack of documents so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She swallowed hard, seemingly battling with herself before speaking. Trump glanced at her, his gaze sharp but not cold. He tilted his head slightly. "Do you have something to say?" The woman hesitated for a moment, as if debating whether she should stand up or not. Finally, unable to hold back any longer, she slowly rose to her feet, her voice trembling. I don't mean to intrude." Matthew frowned, showing his irritation at the unexpected situation. "Who are you?" She took a deep breath, her eyes brimming with tears. "I am Sarah Anderson. I have no intention of criticizing anyone. I don't know what else to do." Matthew glanced at Trump, trying to regain control of the conversation. But Trump remained silent, waiting. Sarah bit her lip before speaking in a choked voice. "My son, Tommy, is only 14 years old. But he has been growing at an abnormal rate. The doctor said he might have a rare disease. But I don't have enough money for testing. I have knocked on so many doors. But no one will help me." She paused, silent tears streaming down her face. Some members of the audience began whispering, while others lowered their heads in thought. Matthew quickly tried to interject, his voice urgent. "I understand, but today's program is not about this matter. We are here to discuss Barron Trump." "No," Trump interrupted, his voice calm yet commanding. "We are talking about something far more important." Matthew froze, clear confusion on his face. "What do you mean?" Trump slowly reached under the table, pulling out a thick stack of documents and holding them up to the cameras. "I already know about Tommy's case. Not just him, but many other children are in the same situation." The entire studio fell silent. Matthew's eyes widened, unable to hide his shock. A wave of emotion surged through the audience. 4 months ago, when this question first appeared on your show, I decided to investigate the root of the problem, not to stir up a scandal, but because I wanted to understand why a mother had to plead with the public on live television. Trump slowly opened the file in front of him, the stage lights illuminating the carefully arranged pages. This is Tommy's entire medical record. A list of hospitalizations, tests, prescriptions, total medical expenses, $257,800. The boy's family knocked on the doors of 21 doctors, sold their car, and worked 3 jobs at once just to make ends meet. Sarah placed her hand over her mouth. Her eyes widened, and her breath caught in her throat. Tears streamed down her cheeks. Silent but heavy, Trump did not take his eyes off Matthew, his voice steady but carrying the weight of a hammer striking down. "And do you know what we did?" He paused for a moment, letting the question linger in the silent air. "The Trump Foundation paid the entire amount last week." The studio erupted. Some gasped in shock. Others burst into relentless applause. Emotion flooded the hall like a powerful wave. Sarah bowed her head. Unable to hold back any longer, she sobbed uncontrollably, her shoulders shaking with each gasp. Matthew, who had once manipulated interviews like a puppet master, now just sat there, his face pale, his fingers interlocked on the table as if searching for an anchor. Everything was slipping out of his control. Trump slowly leaned forward, his eyes shining with an unshakable determination. "You wanted to talk about DNA, didn't you? Fine, but not in the way you expected." The entire studio fell into silence. No more whispers, no more clicking cameras, only breathless anticipation remained. Matthew swallowed dryly, his eyes darting to the cameras pointing at him. For the first time, he didn't know what to say. "Mr. Trump, Matthew began, but his voice trembled, lacking its usual sharpness. Trump raised a hand, cutting off the defense before it could be spoken. No need for evasions. His voice was firm, each word carved into the air. "You owe the audience, and especially Mrs. Anderson, something far greater than an apology." Matthew shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his eyes darting away, searching for an escape. "An apology? What exactly are you implying?" He tried to regain his usual composure, but his hesitation betrayed him. Trump remained unwavering, his gaze as cold as steel. "You tried to turn a very real issue into a media circus just to grab attention. But what's the truth, Matthew? The truth is that while you were busy stirring controversy, we were taking real action. We helped the families you never even spared a second to care about." The room sank into a heavy silence. No one could deny the truth that had just been laid bare. Every eye was fixed on Matthew, not because of his provocative questions, but because they were witnessing an undeniable reality. He had lost. Trump looked straight into the camera, his gaze strong, his message not just for those present in the room. "Now, let's really talk about what matters most here. Not meaningless hypotheses, not cheap sensationalism, but the people out there, the ones who truly need help." The auditorium buzzed, whispers spreading through the crowd like small waves. The tension was palpable. Seated in his chair, Matthew Johnson stiffened. He had pushed this conversation too far. And now, the truth itself was turning against him. Trump silently reached under the table, pulling out a thick folder. Without hesitation, he raised it high, ensuring that everyone in the studio, and the millions watching live, could see it. "This is what you overlooked, Matthew." Trump's voice was calm but carried immense weight. "A story you didn't bother mentioning because it wasn't sensational enough." He placed the folder on the table, slowly flipping through the pages, revealing hospital bills, medical reports, and handwritten notes from doctors. "This is Tommy's life." Trump looked directly into the camera. "A child who doesn't deserve to go through this." The room felt frozen as he continued. "His mother has worked day and night, struggling through each month just to pay for medical expenses she could never catch up with. She didn't ask for attention. She didn't seek pity. The only thing she wanted was for someone to help, and that is exactly what we did." In the audience, Sarah Anderson clasped her hands tightly, tears streaming down her weary face. But this time, they weren't just tears of despair, they were tears of relief. Something she hadn't felt in a long time. Trump shifted his gaze toward the crowd, then back to the camera, his voice growing stronger. "This was never about me. Never about Barron. This is about the people out there. The ones who fight every single day just to survive." Matthew Johnson tried to regain his composure. But his wavering eyes betrayed him. The sharp, confident man who always knew how to turn the situation around was now silent before the wave of truth crashing down on him. Trump placed both hands on the table. Leaning forward, "You wanted to make a child the focal point of a meaningless debate. But you never mentioned the thousands of families we've helped, the people we didn't boast about. Didn't parade around, but simply supported. And that is the real difference." Matthew opened his mouth, but no words came out. His usual confidence had vanished, replaced by a hesitation he couldn't hide. Trump turned to Sarah Anderson, his gaze softening. "Mrs. Anderson, you are not just a sensational story for views. You are a person. Your family deserves support, and that is why we are here." Sarah nodded, her voice trembling as she tried to speak. I never thought anyone truly cared. I just hoped someone would listen, but I never thought someone would actually take action." Trump gave her a small smile and nodded. "Because people like you are not talked about enough. But the work we do is not for recognition. It is to make sure that those who need help actually receive help." A moment of silence filled the studio. Then, like a ripple spreading, applause broke out, at first scattered, then stronger, more resolute. Some in the audience nodded, while others quickly wiped their eyes. Matthew Johnson bowed his head, no longer carrying his usual sharp demeanor. He knew he had lost, not to an argument, but to the undeniable truth itself. Trump did not need to say anything more. He had said what needed to be said, leaving an indelible mark. Silence enveloped the room, though Matthew had tried to steer the conversation in a negative direction. No one cared about his words anymore. The tense atmosphere had now shifted into a collective awakening. Trump crossed his arms, looking straight into the camera with a steady gaze. "What are we really talking about here?" His voice was calm yet firm. "A DNA test? Or the fact that we are spending too much time prying into personal lives instead of actually taking action on more important matters?" His words were like a slap to the sensationalism Matthew had been pushing. The eyes in the room were no longer focused on the host. They were all on Trump now. Matthew swallowed hard, trying to regain control. "But, Mr. Trump, don't you think that transparency on this issue would help your family's image?" Trump raised an eyebrow slightly and shook his head slowly. "Image? You think this is about image, Matthew? No. This is about real people who need real help." He turned back to the audience. "Families like Tommy's, they are what we should be talking about. And instead of wasting time on meaningless distractions, we choose to act." A wave of emotion surged through the crowd. Some nodded in agreement, others clapped in support. Matthew suddenly looked smaller than ever. He knew he had lost this battle, but he still clung to the last shred of control. Then what about Barron Trump? What does he have to say about this? As soon as the question ended, the camera frame shifted. A tall figure stepped in, the light illuminating the calm face of Barron Trump. He looked straight into the camera, a slight but sincere smile appearing on his lips. "Tommy, I heard you're just as tall as me?" Barron's voice rang out, not a defense, but a warm connection. "It's okay, buddy. No matter where you are, you're not alone. We're always with you." A long silence followed, not out of awkwardness, but because everyone was absorbing the meaning of those words. It wasn't just an empty phrase on television. It was a promise. Matthew opened his mouth, about to say something, but then closed it again. There was nothing he could say at this moment without making himself look small. The camera slowly zoomed out to the crowd, where the previous division had now been replaced by a deep sense of unity. In that moment, there were no more arguments. No more sensational plots. Only an undeniable truth remained. Kindness and action were always stronger than any rumor. The interview was no longer the interrogation that Matthew Johnson had expected. Instead, it had turned into a rare moment on television, a genuine moment, where clichés and media manipulation had no place. It was no longer a mere debate about power or influence. It had become proof of the strength of belief and true values. Trump stood firm, his eyes shining with the confidence of a man who had weathered countless storms. He had not only withstood the attacks but had turned the tables, leaving his opponent without a foothold. A strange silence filled the studio. Not one of confusion, not one of fear, but of contemplation. The audience no longer saw him as a controversial figure. but as a person with clear ideals. Matthew Johnson, the man who prided himself on twisting the truth to his advantage, now sat motionless. The sharpness in his eyes had faded, replaced by a quiet, bewildered expression. He had prepared a script for a scandal, but what unfolded before him had spiraled beyond his control. Instead of destroying his opponent, he had become the passive figure in the very narrative he sought to manipulate. Trump adjusted his cufflinks lightly, his voice steady yet as sharp as a razor. "You know, Matthew," he began, his gaze locking onto the host, "what you're trying to do isn't new. You people always want to create controversial stories, to make the audience believe that my family is just a flashy symbol, disconnected from the people." He paused briefly, letting his words sink in before continuing. "But you were wrong. What truly matters isn't me, isn't Barron, but what we've done, the real actions that you and your colleagues never talk about." Johnson tried to regain his composure, but his voice no longer carried the certainty it once had. "But Mr. Trump," he said, "do you think there exists an undeniable gap between those in power and ordinary citizens? That your wealth and influence have placed your family in a position others could never reach?" Trump leaned back in his chair, his eyes reflecting determination. "Yes, there is a gap, but not in the way you think," he replied, his voice unwavering. "The real divide isn't in money or power. It lies with people like you, Matthew, those who sit in studios, making a living by sowing doubt and creating meaningless debates instead of taking action to change reality." The atmosphere in the studio grew heavy. Some audience members nodded, while others exchanged quiet glances, as if they were truly reflecting on what was unfolding. There were no more murmurs, no more superficial reactions, only an undeniable truth, one that no sensational headline could distort. Those words hit Matthew like a punch to the chest, leaving him momentarily stunned. A wave of unease rose within him. Perhaps he had been too stubborn. Perhaps he had not anticipated the unwavering resolve of the man before him. But he could not stop now. He swallowed dryly, his voice retaining its sharpness. "But Mr. Trump, who can guarantee that the Trump Foundation is truly doing enough? You are a businessman, you have built a vast empire. How can the public be sure this isn't just an image-polishing campaign?" Trump slowly leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing with confidence. A slight smile flickered at the corner of his lips, not one of arrogance, but of someone who knew exactly where he stood. "Let me tell you this, Matthew," he said, his voice deep and weighted with meaning. "The Trump Foundation doesn't exist to draw attention. We don't do this for headlines or polished promotional videos. We do this because it needs to be done." He paused, his sharp gaze sweeping across the room. "We don't need cameras. We don't need praise. When someone like Sarah Anderson comes to us in desperation, we don't stand by and judge. We act, not for fame, not for political gain, but because it is the right thing to do." At that moment, Sarah, the woman who had been standing quietly in the background, stepped forward, her eyes shining with both emotion and gratitude. She took a deep breath before speaking, her voice trembling slightly but steady. "Mr. Trump, I don't think I can fully express what I feel right now. My family was pushed to the edge, and no one was willing to lend a hand. But you did what no one else would. You saved my son, Tommy, and I truly don't know how to thank you enough." Trump looked at her, his expression softening. "You don't need to thank me, Sarah," he said, his voice low and sincere. "What matters most is that Tommy will have the chance he deserves. That is what truly matters." The auditorium was so silent that one could hear the breath of every individual. Some audience members discreetly wiped away their tears. Doubt gradually gave way to something deeper, understanding. Matthew gripped the microphone tightly, he couldn't let himself loose so easily. "But Mr. Trump," he tried to keep his voice steady, "the public has a different perception of you. You are wealthy, you are powerful, you have everything. But what about those who are still struggling out there? They feel like they are being left behind. What do you say to them?" Trump leaned forward slightly, his gaze growing sharper. "You know, Matthew, there's something people tend to forget. Not everyone starts from the same point. But what matters is not where we stand, it's what we do with that position. Yes, I have wealth. Yes, I have influence. But instead of just talking, I use it to truly make a difference." Barron grew up with this mindset. And that is exactly what the Trump Foundation pursues, creating real change. At that moment, no one interrupted. There were no murmurs, no skepticism, only the heavy silence of those who had just witnessed a conversation that was no longer merely a debate. It was a moment of truth. And sometimes, truth is the most powerful thing that moves people. Under the studio lights, Matthew opened his mouth to counter. But the words caught in his throat. He couldn't deny the reality unfolding before him. His plan to manipulate public opinion, to turn the interview into a dramatic confrontation, had completely collapsed. Instead, the truth had spoken for itself. The screen behind them lit up once more. The entire auditorium fell silent as Barron Trump appeared. The teenager stood tall, his eyes full of sincerity and confidence. No pre-written script, no elaborate rhetoric, just a simple yet powerful message. He looked directly into the camera, his voice warm yet firm. "Tommy, I heard that you're also a boy with exceptional height. Don't worry, many of us have felt out of place before. But we are not alone. You are not alone." Those simple words seemed to touch the hearts of everyone watching. It wasn't a political statement, nor a media stunt. This was a genuine human connection. The screen gradually faded to black. Trump turned to Matthew Johnson, his gaze calm yet sharp. "This is my answer, Matthew," he said, his voice deep and commanding. "It's not about fame or power. It's about how we choose to act when it truly matters." The entire room erupted in thunderous applause. No longer just passive spectators. They had become part of the powerful message spreading through the space. Matthew Johnson sat in silence, the studio lights no longer seeming to shine on him. He had entered the interview with the ambition of exposing a scandal. But now, he could only watch as the truth unfolded before his eyes. Trump leaned back in his chair, whispering softly, as if speaking to himself. "You've lost, Matthew." But then, another voice rang out, drawing the attention of the entire studio. "Mr. Trump." A man stepped out from the crowd, his gaze sharp but not confrontational. "You speak of helping, of positive change. But how do you respond to those who say this is all just a performance? That you're using this to bolster your image? To gain more votes?" The room fell silent again. The weight of the question hung in the air, a true challenge. Trump turned to face the man, his expression unwavering. He narrowed his eyes, pondering for a moment before replying slowly. "Have you ever asked yourself, what have those critics actually done? Have they truly helped anyone? Or do they simply stand on the sidelines, watching and judging?" The man held his ground, not backing down. "I'm not here to criticize you," he said, his voice calm. "But I want to know, are you truly willing to invest your dedication, time, and even your own money into what you're saying? Or, in the end, is this just another political maneuver?" The tension in the studio thickened. Trump's gaze remained steady, but instead of responding immediately, he gave a slight nod, as if carefully considering his answer. The story was far from over, and the whole world was watching. Trump leaned back in his chair, his eyes momentarily cold yet composed. In the charged atmosphere, he could feel the anticipation from those around him. This was not just an ordinary political debate. This was a test, a question not merely about power, but about integrity, about the true meaning of leadership. "You think I do this for fame? For personal gain?" Trump spoke, his voice deep and resolute. "No, I do it because I believe it is the right thing to do. When a family like Sarah's is struggling, we don't wait. We don't weigh whether it benefits us politically. We take action immediately." He paused briefly, his gaze sweeping over the crowd in front of him. The audience was silent. They were listening. Call it privilege if you want. Call it a strategy if that makes it easier for you to accept. But to me, it's responsibility. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes locking onto the man across from him. Responsibility to those who cannot stand up for themselves. Responsibility to a country that has given me the opportunity to make a difference. A long silence followed, as if the entire room was absorbing every word he had said. The man opposite him, initially skeptical, now looked at Trump differently. Slowly, he nodded, something shifting in his thoughts. "I didn't think I would say this." His voice softened. "But maybe I've been too focused on criticizing and have forgotten something more important, the actual results. Perhaps it's time we stop arguing over perspectives and start talking about what can truly be done." Trump looked at him, then gave a slight smile, a rare but sincere expression. "Exactly. In the end, we all want the same thing. A country where no one is left behind. A future where everyone has a chance. Not because of their background or wealth, but because they deserve it. The atmosphere in the studio shifted noticeably. The tension that had been present earlier gradually faded, giving way to an unexpected sense of empathy. The debate was no longer a battle of words but had become a moment of genuine understanding. And that moment changed the course of the conversation in an unforeseen way. For the first time throughout the interview, Matthew Johnson was no longer in control. The atmosphere in the studio seemed to shift in a way he hadn't anticipated. Donald Trump had redirected the focus away from himself, toward real people, real stories. The entire room seemed to pause, waiting for his next words. "We're not here to argue about me," Trump said, his gaze sweeping across the audience, his voice steady yet commanding. "We're here for something bigger, to seek solutions together, to create real change." Silence hung in the air for a moment. Then a scattered applause broke out. That hesitant clapping quickly spread, growing into a strong wave of approval. Faces that had once been filled with skepticism now began to soften. Heads nodded, and some even wiped away tears. No one felt like this was just another interview anymore. It had become a defining moment, a turning point. On stage, Trump leaned back, his expression more relaxed, a hint of contemplation in his eyes. The tension was gone. The defensive stance had disappeared. The space around him was now filled with support, a stark contrast to the intense confrontation at the beginning. The cameras panned across the audience, capturing raw, unfiltered reactions, eyes lighting up, cheers mixed with the continuous applause. In the blink of an eye, Trump had turned the situation around, transforming what could have been a difficult exchange into a memorable display of leadership and compassion. But as the applause continued, the storm of public opinion was only just beginning. Outside the studio, social media erupted, phones rang non-stop, and news agencies scrambled to analyze the unfolding situation. The entire media landscape seemed stunned. In the control room, Matthew Johnson stood frozen, his eyes locked on the screen, his fingers tightened slightly. An hour ago, he had been confident that he would control the narrative, that he would expose a sensational story. But now, he realized he had underestimated his opponent. Trump had not only navigated the tough questions, he had completely turned the conversation around, transforming it into a powerful moment of connection and emotion. What Matthew once saw as his opponent's weaknesses had become his greatest strengths. And worse, Matthew realized that his old way of doing journalism, relying on harsh and sensational interrogations, might no longer be relevant. The audience no longer wanted meaningless debates. They wanted something more authentic, something more valuable. And tonight, they found it in a place Matthew least expected. Trump's speech was like a wave stirring public opinion. Across social media platforms, countless posts, videos, and comments flooded in. Some people cheered in support. Others remained skeptical, but no one could deny it. The narrative was shifting. Hashtags like #NewLeadership and #TrumpImpact exploded, making it onto global trending lists. The Trump Foundation's website recorded a surge in traffic, with thousands of people eagerly learning about the charitable programs the organization was carrying out. Now, instead of criticizing Trump's personal life, the public was beginning to focus on what he was doing to change the lives of those in need. In a small suburban apartment, Sarah Anderson sat on the sofa, her eyes glued to the TV screen. Her son, Tommy, sat beside her, silently watching. The interview had ended, but its impact still lingered in the air. Sarah squeezed her son's hand, her voice trembling. "Tommy, I never thought I'd witness this," she whispered, her eyes glistening with tears. "No one ever really cared about us before." Tommy turned to look at his mother, his young eyes glowing with an indescribable emotion. "But now they see us. Mom, they know we exist, and they care." Outside, thousands of people like Sarah and Tommy were feeling the same way. Patients, families burdened by financial struggles, people who had once felt hopeless. Now, they were no longer alone. They were not just seen but understood. In the studio, Trump slowly stood up. He looked around the room, where every gaze was still fixed on him. One battle had ended, but he knew well that the road ahead was still long. What truly mattered, what would be etched into history, was only just beginning. If you love emotional stories that offer fresh and meaningful perspectives, hit subscribe Now so you don't miss any videos. Don't forget to like, share, and leave your thoughts in the comments. Pushpin. Warning: important notice. The story in this video is purely fictional. Created for entertainment purposes and to convey meaningful messages. All events, characters, and details in the video do not reflect reality. We do not intend to judge or defame any individual or organization. Thank you for watching. Sparkling Heart.